I came home to find a bright orange foreclosure sticker slapped across my front door like a scarlet letter. The adhesive was so strong I had to claw at it with my keys, just to peel back the edges, but the bold black print still seared into my eyes. Property auctioned. Vacate immediately. My knees went weak, and for a moment the quiet hum of cicadas in the summer evening faded into a deafening roar of disbelief. The smell of sun-baked asphalt mixed with the faint sweetness of Sarah's. Roses drifting over the fence, the last living trace of her presence. I'd spent years tending that garden in her memory, trimming lavender by hand, kneeling in the dirt until my calloused fingers ached. And now some HOA bureaucrat had sold the soil right out from under me while I was serving overseas. My house. My wife's memory, gone with the flick of a pen at a courthouse auction. 6 months earlier, I'd been on a military assignment in Eastern Europe. Long days, freezing winds, the rattle of old transport trucks hauling equipment across muddy roads. I'd left my modest Virginia home behind, trusting the HOA dues were on autopay like always, trusting my mortgage lender and HOA board to handle their clerical nonsense while I handled the job of protecting my country. But trust is a dangerous currency in suburbia. Somewhere between my deployment and return, they claimed I'd fallen behind on a few $100s in fees, late notices, supposedly piled up in my mailbox like snowdrifts I couldn't see from half a world away. And when I didn't respond, they did what they always threaten, but almost never follow through on. They foreclosed. Walking through my front yard that night, everything felt tainted. The crisp sound of sprinklers kicking on in a neighbor's yard was no longer comforting, it was mocking. Porch lights glowed warm behind white-trimmed windows up and down the cul-de-sac, while mine sat dark, locked, alien. My pickup sat in the driveway like a stranded relic, its tires caked in red dust from base training grounds. It hadn't moved in weeks, maybe months. My house wasn't mine anymore, not legally. Some nameless bidder at a courthouse had bought it for pennies on the dollar while I was halfway across the world. But the neighborhood wasn't silent. Curtains shifted as I stood there clutching that notice, neighbors peering out like I was already a trespasser on land I'd built my life around. The faint scent of grilled meat from 2 doors down clashed with the bile rising in my throat. The HOA president, a smug man named Charles Whitaker, had orchestrated all of this. The same man who once sent me a violation notice for leaving my garbage can out an extra 30 minutes. The same man who measured my lawn with a tape ruler during one hot July, claiming my grass was a 1/4 inch too long. Charles, with his pressed polos and manicured lawn that looked like AstroTurf, had weaponized every bylaw against me, and now he had crossed a line so sharp it might as well have been carved in granite. Inside, the air smelled stale, as though even the house itself had stopped breathing without me. Dust motes danced in the golden light slipping through blinds, landing on unpaid HOA notices that sat stacked like tombstones on the kitchen counter. Every envelope was thick, embossed, cream-colored, the kind that felt expensive enough to make you think the words inside carried authority. Late fees, fines, interest, threats. And somewhere in that pile, the legal papers that paved the way for strangers to claim everything I'd worked for. My chest tightened as I moved into the living room. The leather recliner where I'd fallen asleep countless nights after deployments seemed smaller, diminished, like it knew I was no longer its rightful owner. Sarah's quilt still draped across the back. A photo of us from our wedding day sat crooked on the mantel, the glass cracked at the corner. She'd been gone 5 years now, but the house had always been my anchor, my link to her. Losing it to a petty neighborhood association felt like losing her all over again. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a black coffee that tasted bitterer than usual, spreading papers out under the weak overhead light. Each violation notice had Charles Whitaker's neat looping signature at the bottom, like a stamp of arrogance. Trash cans visible, weeds exceeding community standards, an unapproved American flagpole too tall by 2 feet. Every petty complaint had stacked into a mountain, and from the top of that mountain, they had pushed me straight into foreclosure. But as dawn broke, I realized something. Charles and his HOA board thought I was another easy victim, another homeowner too exhausted, or too broke to fight back. They thought the uniform I wore overseas meant I wasn't watching. They thought auctioning off my house while I was serving meant they'd won. But they had made a fatal miscalculation, because I hadn't just come home to a foreclosure notice. I had come home with friends in the Department of Justice, contacts in military legal offices, and a deep understanding of how federal law protects active service members. The HOA had just opened a door they weren't ready to walk through, and if Charles Whitaker wanted to turn my life into a war zone, he was about to learn what happens when you corner a soldier with nothing left to lose. The first step was to understand exactly what they'd done and how they'd gotten away with it. I spent that morning at the county courthouse, my boots echoing across marble floors that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The clerk handed me a thick file folder, its edges dog-eared from passing between hands. Inside were copies of the foreclosure filings, stamped in official blue ink, each page reeking of bureaucratic precision. Buried in the middle was the so-called Notice of Delinquent Assessments. According to the paperwork, the HOA claimed I owed $1,182 late fees, interest, administrative costs. That number had started as just a few missed dues, but Whitaker's board had fattened it like livestock headed to slaughter. What shocked me most wasn't the inflated balance, it was the timeline. The HOA had filed for foreclosure less than 60 days after the alleged missed payment. No warning, no grace period, just a rush to strip a man of his home while he was in another country. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I turned the pages, my jaw tightening. There it was, the auction record. My 3-bedroom house, with its handmade bookshelves and Sarah's rose garden out back, had been sold for just $9,200, less than the price of a used compact car. I pictured strangers walking through my living room, strangers standing in the doorway of the bedroom I once shared with my wife, deciding what they'd do with my life's work. Walking out into the humid Virginia air, I could taste the metallic tang of fury in the back of my throat. My boots scuffed the courthouse steps harder than necessary. I wasn't just fighting to save 4 walls and a roof. I was fighting to stop Charles Whitaker from turning military service into a vulnerability he could exploit. And as I lit a cigarette I hadn't touched in years, I made myself a promise. They were going to regret underestimating me. That night, I started digging. The smell of stale coffee and printer ink filled my dining room as I spread case files across the table. Laptops humming, stacks of printed statutes rising like barricades. The Service Members Civil Relief Act, that was my first weapon. Federal law that explicitly barred foreclosures against active duty service members without a court order. Whitaker and his little suburban cabal had either ignored it or were too arrogant to think I'd push back. Either way, they'd just set themselves up for federal scrutiny. I thought about Sarah as I flipped through those papers, about the way she used to remind me that bullies always counted on silence. She was right. Whitaker had silenced plenty of neighbors with fines, intimidation, and his smug little smile. But I wasn't built for silence. The next morning I walked into the HOA office with a calmness that felt like armor. The air inside smelled of air freshener and cold coffee. Charles Whitaker was seated at a polished oak desk, his polo collar perfectly stiff, his Rolex glinting under fluorescent lights. He looked up, surprised to see me. "Mr. Hall, I thought you'd moved out by now," he said, his voice thick with false courtesy. I laid a manila folder on his desk. "That's a copy of the Service Members Civil Relief Act," I said evenly, "which you violated when you auctioned my house while I was deployed overseas." For the first time, Whitaker's smirk faltered. He glanced down at the statute, then back at me, trying to recover. "The board acted within its rights," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. His perfume of arrogance, cologne, mixed with entitlement, hung heavy in the air. I leaned forward, close enough for him to see the exhaustion carved into my face. You didn't just mess with a homeowner, you messed with a federal case. And trust me, you don't want the U.S. Attorney's Office asking why a homeowners association thought it was above federal law. The silence between us was thick. Somewhere down the hall, a copier whirred and beeped, its mechanical rhythm filling the gap. Whitaker's hands fidgeted with a pen, clicking it again and again. That was the moment I knew he understood. He'd pushed too far. And I wasn't going to stop until either my home was back in my name, or his empire of fines and threats was reduced to rubble. But as I walked out of that office, the summer sun hot on my neck, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every neighbor who'd been bullied into silence, every family who'd caved to his intimidation. Whitaker had built his reputation on fear. I was about to replace that fear with something else entirely. Word travels fast in suburban neighborhoods, faster than wildfire on a windy hillside. Within 48 hours of confronting Whitaker, half the cul-de-sac seemed to know I wasn't going quietly. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for years suddenly offered hesitant nods at the mailbox. A retired teacher across the street left a pie on my porch with no note, just a quiet gesture of solidarity. Fear was starting to crack, and in its place, whispers of resistance surfaced. But not everyone approved. One evening, as I was pulling weeds in Sarah's rose garden, a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of my house. The tinted windows slid down, and Whitaker's right-hand enforcer, Janet, his vice president and self-proclaimed keeper of community standards, leaned out. Her perfume hit before her words, sharp and artificial. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said flatly. "The board followed procedure. If you make trouble, it'll only get worse." The window slid back up before I could answer, the SUV gliding away like a shark retreating into dark waters. The faint growl of its engine lingered in the humid night air, mixing with the fragrance of lavender and roses. I stared after it, the soil still clinging to my gloves. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of what I was doing. It wasn't just a fight, it was war. That night, my dining room transformed into a command center. The glow of 2 laptops lit the stacks of paperwork like floodlights on a battlefield. Case law, federal statutes, even obscure HOA precedents. I combed through them all. Each click of my mouse was a step deeper into the maze Whitaker had built. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't just mishandled my foreclosure. They'd broken laws so blatantly it was almost reckless. The Service Members' Civil Relief Act was ironclad. No foreclosure could happen without a court order when the homeowner was active duty. Whitaker had bypassed that completely, shoving my house onto the auction block with nothing but rubber-stamped HOA signatures. I could almost hear Sarah's voice urging me on. "Don't stop now. They've overplayed their hand." The next day, I filed formal complaints. Federal Housing Authority, Department of Justice, even the local news tip line. My email inbox filled with auto-responses, but I knew the right eyes would catch this eventually. And when they did, Whitaker's empire of cream-colored violation, notices would come under a microscope he couldn't control. But the HOA didn't sit idle. A certified letter arrived 2 mornings later, thick and intimidating in its ivory envelope. Inside was a final demand for me to vacate, written in dense legal jargon designed to scare. They called me a trespasser in my own home. My blood boiled as I read it under the buzzing hum of the kitchen light. Trespasser? I'd bled in foreign soil while these people measured grass blades. I wasn't about to walk away. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunset paint streaks of crimson and gold across the sky. The cicadas screamed their chorus, drowning out the hum of distant lawnmowers. Neighbors peeked out again, curtains shifting, porch lights flicking on early. They were waiting to see what would happen next. And then, it happened. My phone buzzed, with a call from a Washington, D.C. number I didn't recognize. On the other end was a calm voice introducing himself as a federal investigator reviewing my complaint. The man's words were steady, clinical, but each one hit like a drumbeat. Mr. Hall, your case is under preliminary review. On the surface, it appears the HOA's actions may constitute unlawful foreclosure under federal statute. For the first time since peeling that foreclosure sticker off my front door, I felt the faintest ember of hope. The law wasn't just on my side. It was loaded, cocked, and pointed directly at Charles Whitaker's heart. But hope is dangerous. Because it meant the HOA would fight back harder, and desperation makes even the most polished tyrant reckless. The letterhead from the U.S. Attorney's Office arrived 3 weeks later. Heavy stock paper, embossed seal, the kind of document that makes even the cockiest HOA president sweat through his pressed polo. It was a notice of investigation, formal, undeniable, and damning. Whitaker's board was being asked to provide records of the foreclosure, financial accounts, and correspondence regarding my property. When I held that letter in my hands, I could almost hear Sarah whispering, "You've got them now." But victory wasn't yet in reach. Whitaker was too proud to fold quietly. The next HOA meeting proved it. It was held in the community clubhouse, that sterile little room with fluorescent lights that hummed like a swarm of insects. Folding chairs were lined up in stiff rows, and the smell of stale coffee and supermarket cookies hung in the air. Residents filled every seat. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear. A few even dared to hope. Whitaker opened the meeting with his usual smug confidence, his voice booming against the drywall. "Ladies and gentlemen, it has come to my attention that certain unfounded accusations have been made against this board. Let me be clear, we have acted entirely within our rights." His Rolex glinted as he gestured, his manicured nails tapping the lectern. I stood in the back, arms crossed, listening. My pulse thudded steadily in my ears. When he finally paused, I stepped forward. The room went quiet, chairs creaking as people turned to look. "You auctioned my house while I was deployed overseas," I said, my voice carrying more weight than volume. "And now the federal government is investigating you for it." Gasps rippled through the room. A few heads nodded. Others ducked, unwilling to be seen siding with me. Whitaker's face flushed crimson, but his eyes darted nervously. For the first time, his armor was cracking. He stammered something about community bylaws and miscommunication, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. After the meeting, neighbors approached me quietly, one by one. An older couple whispered about how they'd been fined $1,000 for a garden shed. A single mother admitted she'd paid thousands in special assessments she never understood. It was like floodgates opening. Stories of intimidation, threats, and fear poured out. Whitaker hadn't just wronged me. He'd built his reign of power on silence and shame. The very next morning, federal investigators arrived. Black sedans parked in front of the HOA office, agents in dark suits stepping out with briefcases and calm efficiency. The sight drew curtains. Back across the cul-de-sac, neighbors peering from behind blinds like schoolchildren watching the principal march into class. Whitaker tried to spin it as a routine audit, but the way his hands shook when he fumbled with his keys told a different story. I stood on my porch, sipping bitter black coffee, watching the so-called king of our cul-de-sac squirm as agents carted boxes of files into their cars. The scent of cut grass hung in the morning air, mingling with the electric buzz of inevitability, but the battle wasn't over. A week later, Whitaker showed up at my door himself, his cologne thick enough to choke the room when I opened the door. "You don't understand what you've started," he hissed, his perfect smile stretched too thin. "This community will fall apart if you keep pushing. Property values will plummet. No one will thank you." I let him finish, then held up the federal notice I'd received that morning, An official freeze on any transfer of my property until the investigation concluded. His eyes flicked to the seal, and in that split second, I saw fear for the first time. Real fear. The HOA had taken everything from me, but in their arrogance, they had handed me something more powerful. The law, the truth, and a story no one could bury anymore. And as Whitaker turned and stormed down my walkway, the crunch of gravel under his loafers sharp in the summer air, I knew the endgame was near. The final blow didn't come with shouting or gavel banging at some HOA hearing. It came quietly, in the form of another envelope, this one from the federal court. Inside was a ruling that sliced through Whitaker's empire like a hot knife, through wax. The foreclosure was void, the auction was nullified. My deed was reinstated, and the HOA was barred from pursuing further action until the investigation concluded. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning light spilling through the blinds, the smell of fresh coffee hanging in the air. My hands trembled as I held that paper. For the first time in months, the bitterness in my chest loosened. My home was mine again, not because Whitaker allowed it, not because the HOA relented, but because the law had exposed them for what they were. The neighborhood changed after that. People who once kept their heads down began speaking out. At the next meeting, residents demanded Whitaker's resignation. His smug composure was gone. The man looked smaller, diminished, his words falling flat against a room that no longer feared him. Janet avoided eye contact, shuffling papers nervously like a student caught cheating. And then came the knock at his door. Not from me, not from a neighbor, but from federal agents. The sight of Whitaker being led down his driveway in a crisp suit that suddenly looked too tight was burned into the memory of everyone on our block. The community kingpin reduced to a defendant. His Range Rover sat idle in the driveway, a silent monument to arrogance undone. Neighbors who had once avoided me now lingered in conversation. The retired teacher brought another pie, this time with a note. Thank you for standing up when the rest of us couldn't. Even kids on bikes slowed down as they passed my yard, their parents no longer yanking them away out of fear of being associated with me. One evening, I sat in Sarah's rose garden. The air was heavy with the fragrance of late summer blooms, the same scent that used to cling to her hair when she came in from the yard. I thought about everything. The deployment, the betrayal, the long nights drowning in statutes and paperwork. And I realized something. This fight had never been about just one house. It was about dignity. About refusing to let power-hungry tyrants disguise themselves as community leaders. About making sure no one else came home from serving their country to find strangers had stolen their life out from under them. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, I felt Sarah's presence in the silence, and I knew she'd be proud. The HOA thought they could strip me of everything. But all they did was teach me how to win, not just for myself, but for everyone they'd ever bullied into silence. The war was over. And this time, the right side had won.